Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and welcome to Biology Essentials Video 1. This is on natural selection, so I've included a picture here of Charles Darwin. Most people think that Charles Darwin is famous because he somehow invented evolution. That's not totally accurate. Why Charles Darwin is famous is that he's the first scientist that really gave us a mechanism that explains how evolution, especially adaptation, can occur. And so if you're trying to learn biology, the best place to start is with Charles Darwin and a better understanding of natural selection. Before we can talk about natural selection, however, we should define what evolution is. And so in this class, in evolution is simply going to be changes, biological evolution, is any changes to the gene pool. So a gene pool is a combination of all the genes in a population, or we call those different varieties alleles in a population. And so according to scientists, the gene pool should remain at equilibrium. In other words, the frequency of the different alleles will never change unless you violate one of these 5 constraints of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And it happens all the time. So evolution is constantly occurring, and it can occur if you have a small population, non-random mating, mutations, migration. So these 5 things can cause evolution, but we're going to talk about those later. Today I want to talk about selection, because selection is when you live or die. It's called differential reproductive success, when you live or die based on the appearance that you have. In other words, you're made the way you are, and as the environment changes, you're selected. Either you have high fitness and you're able to survive and pass your genes on, or you have low fitness and you die. And if you have enough fitness over time, that can eventually lead to adaptations in a population. So the smallest unit that it actually can evolve is a population, and it simply changes in the gene pool. Why do we start with natural selection? Well, of these 5 things here, it's the only one that can lead to adaptation, or organisms that are better adapted to their environment. And so let me give you an example of that. Let's say you have a bacterial infection. Let's say you're infected by a number of bacteria, let's call them 7, and you decide to treat the bacteria. So let's say you take some antibiotics, penicillin for example, and they have different varieties of resistance to that antibiotic. And so when you take the antibiotic on day 1, it destroys or lyses or pops all of these bacteria, those that have low resistance. So these ones are selected. In other words, the ones that have a high resistance are selected for. The ones that had a low resistance are actually going to die. These ones, though, then will reproduce through binary fission, and we're going to have a new population of organisms that have a better resistance to antibiotics. Now, there are 2 ways that we can actually get variety in a population. The only way we can get new, novel characteristics, in other words, like the ability to be resistant to antibiotics, through mutation. And so everything that's been added to that first strand of DNA and that first living thing has been added through a mistake or a change in the DNA, and that's called a mutation. The other thing that can actually create variety is reproduction. And so in bacteria, they use asexual reproduction, but they have mechanisms by which they can change those mutations or vary those mutations or pass them on. In us, it's just sex, and sex is going to take those mutations and then in our offspring create a variety of different types. And so this is just theoretically how natural selection occurs, but let me give you maybe the most famous example of how natural selection occurs in the wilds. And right here is a picture of a peppered moth. A peppered moth has 2 different varieties. It has the dark phenotype or physical characteristic and the light phenotype. Now we know this about moths, that the light phenotype is actually homozygous recessive. In other words, that's a recessive trait. And the dark appearance, you can either be homozygous dominant or you can be heterozygous dominant for that, and you're going to have the dark appearance. And so if you look at this wood right here where it appears today, you can see that this one, the light phenotype or the light physical characteristic, is camouflage. In other words, it fits in. If you're a bird flying over and you're looking for moths to eat, you're not going to see that light appearance, you're going to see the dark appearance, and you're going to go eat that moth. And so you're going to select that dark appearance. You're going to kill that dark appearance, and its genes are going to die with it. And so at this point, the light moth is going to have a higher fitness. It's more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass its genes on generation after generation. So natural selection has created this appearance. Now, why would we even have the dark moth? Well, maybe they can fit in on some of these dark splotches, or maybe they could help them, and that's actually what happened. And so in the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, coal-powered plants started to push coal dust out into the environment, and so the environment started to get darker. In other words, as that coal dust started to accumulate on the trees got darker and darker and darker. When they got darker, these moths that were light in appearance, now they started to pop out, and those are the ones that were going to be preyed on by the birds themselves. And so what happened was a change in the gene pool, and natural selection or evolution occurred. So let's look at some actual numbers. In 1848, 98% of the individuals were light in appearance and only 2% were the dark. And so we can actually figure out what the gene pool frequencies were. And so over here I have 100 genes, and all of them are light right now. And so let's figure out how many actually were light. And so right here, to understand this, you have to have an understanding of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And so here's our famous equation. If you don't know this, you should probably look at the video on Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. P squared stands for the individuals that are homozygous dominant. 2pq stands for the individuals that are heterozygous, and q squared tells us what individuals are, or the frequency of the individuals that are homozygous recessive. And so we can actually use this whenever we're doing these problems. We usually start with the recessive, and we can figure out the allele frequency. And so 98% of the individuals, we know that they are little d, that they're light in appearance. And so I can set q squared equal to 0.98. I could take the square root of both of those, and I've done this earlier, so I know that Q is roughly 0.99. In other words, Q tells us the allele frequency. And so that means that back in the day, in 1848, 99 out of 100 were of the light allele frequency, and only 1 out of 100 were of the dark frequency. And so that's a simple Hardy-Weinberg problem. Now let's see what happens over the next 50 years. Well, if we check back in the next 50 years, we find that the population has changed quite a bit, or it's evolved quite a bit. And so it's almost reversed. So now we have 5% of those that are of the light appearance because they were being preyed on by birds. And 95% of those are on the dark appearance. Let's see what happened to the actual allele frequency. And so we know that Q squared at this point is not 0.98, it's actually 0.05. And so if I take the square root of that, Q now equals roughly 0.22. In other words, the gene pool has changed. The gene pool has changed dramatically. We used to have 99% of the, or 0.99 as our Q value, but now it's only 0.22. And so we still have a lot of those dark around. We still have a lot of those light around, but it's changed over time. And the reason it's changed over time is due to selection. In other words, the environment changed, and when the environment changed, then they adapted, or the population adapted. What can that lead to? Well, that eventually can lead to something called an adaptation. So an adaptation, if we talk about an adaptation, is the best example of, or the best word for that is a process. We tend to think lots of times that an adaptation has to be a physical characteristic, but it could be your behavior that you have. And so what is an adaptation? It's a process that's selected for. In other words, let me give you an example of that. In the Rift Valley, it's a great place to study evolution right now. In the Rift Valley, we have these lakes, and the lakes are inhabited by a type of fish called a cichlid. What's unique about a cichlid is that they have this jaw out here that we can see. It's not quite that big, but they have another jaw back here. It's called a pharyngeal jaw. And what that allows them to do is to use that for different processes, for feeding on different foods. And by doing that, they're able to exploit a number of different niches in that environment. And so what we've seen is an explosion of cichlid populations in these lakes in Africa. It started with just probably one or a few different types of cichlids, and they've adapted to fill all of these different roles. And so they're perfectly adapted for that environment. How did they become perfectly adapted? It's just through a process of natural selection. As that environment starts to change, and they are starting to change, as we get invasive species or fish that weren't there to begin with, then we're going to have pressure, change in the environment, and those species are going to have to adapt. And so this is how we get species. It's just evolution taken to its extreme, where we get macroevolution, or big changes, so species can't interbreed anymore. And so that's a lot, but we're just getting started. And so what's natural selection? Natural selection, if I could give you one example, the best definition for what natural selection is simply differential reproductive success. In other words, we're each made a little bit different. If that allows us to survive and pass those genes on, we have high fitness that eventually can lead to adaptations. But again, there's no goal towards this perfection. It's simply random changes that are selected by the environment. And that's why Charles Darwin is famous. So thanks.